from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien talks about how U.S. soybean sales to countries other than China have picked up substantially in the wake of the U.S.-China trade dispute, and he'll look at the grain trade's predictions on what the USDA crop acreage report will say this coming Monday. Following Dan then, K-State's Romulo Lollato. He'll talk about the latest findings from an ongoing K-State survey of wheat producers about your production practices and how those impact yields. They've uncovered some really interesting things there that Romulo will share with us. And as always on a Friday, K-State's Mary Knapp is in for a look at Kansas agricultural weather. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and good to have you aboard once again for another Agriculture Today. Well, the grain market scene, the eager anticipation is out there for that USDA acreage report. It's coming out Monday morning, and the trade projecting what those numbers might have to say, and we'll talk about those. Also about another active week, to put it very mildly, in the grain trades this past week. Dan O'Brien is with us once again. Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, joining us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. First, though, Dan, the week in review. The trade did take its lumps from the crumbling, if you will, trade situation between the U.S. and China. But since it has turned its attention somewhat away from that and toward weather factors once again.
Weather factors and some underlying demand happening in the soybean complex. Not necessarily with soybeans themselves, although there are reports of whether China will or won't honor previous purchases. But if you look at exports of soybean oil and of soybean meal, you saw other countries such as South Korea and Philippines stepping in and purchasing product. So the low prices that we'd seen coming out last week and previous week into this week merited some buying attention from these other countries. And that's been the thought of what could happen if tariffs on U.S. goods into China take effect, which they have, that we'd see other countries come in and fill in that gap and find that as China was moving towards particularly Brazil and part also Argentina, that they would drive those South American soybean product prices higher, and other countries would come in. So far, that's happened to a degree, but it hasn't happened on a one-for-one basis. It's a fair question as to why it hasn't. I think it has something to do with China's drive to have more than adequate stocks as kind of a risk buffer as to whatever could occur, and their aggressiveness in trying to maintain those stocks. I think it's basically, as you've had other countries come in and replace them, they buy more hand-to-mouth as opposed to China buying ahead. So that's at least one way I try to rationalize why we haven't seen just a pure shift around happen in the soybean markets as we've seen the U.S.-China tariff conflict unfold.
Right. But can these other countries fully fill the void of the absence of business with China? That's the question at hand.
In the long run, I think they will, because we do use X amount of soybeans in the world market. But I guess as these things have hit, again, these policies of China that have led them to maintain large reserves have, I think they've very likely had an impact on how buyers en masse approach the soybean market. Again, China's not coming to the U.S. There's that aggressive element that's not quite there, And other countries, when they come to the U.S., they must be in more of a wait-and-see mode, buying beans as they need them, as opposed to China trying to buy them ahead. In this week's notes, we put a listing from the USDA and their Foreign Ag Service weekly export reports of which countries have increased their purchases in the last year, which ones have decreased. It's really an interesting tale to see who's taken advantage of China's stepping towards South America and who hasn't. So for people to want to be informed in that, you'll have to take a look at something that's listed in metric tons as opposed to bushels. But the changes are there, and countries like Spain and, of course, Mexico and Philippines have kind of changed their practices some, and basically in response to what has been happening between the U.S. and China.
Now, Dan must ask before we move on to that USDA report coming up, is this to infer that the soybean market may be oversensitive to the Chinese trade situation?
Well, I think that the Chinese news in the market certainly makes large headlines, and if you're a more of a spec trader looking for trends that you're responding to, these headlines as they come and go affect your narrative, your understanding of the market. I've wondered more as to whether we've seen kind of an asymmetric response. We've kind of distrusted positive news and really responded negatively to news that, hey, things aren't going as well in those negotiations as otherwise thought. So maybe we're not necessarily balanced. We're probably asymmetric. But you know what? We just have to see how this unfolds. Let's hope by the end of the year that some agreement is reached and more of a free flow of U.S. soybeans to China and their goods into the U.S. can all be, I guess, rectified, and that we don't have to have such an influence of international politics and negotiations affecting ag markets as we certainly have right now.
Well, we know where the market's collective attention will be come 11 o'clock on Monday morning. That's when the USDA releases its latest WASDE report. That will include the latest estimates by the Department of Agriculture on row crop acreage in the U.S. One of the questions, Dan, that you say needs to be clarified, or hopefully will the prevented planted acres be included in the overall report?
There was a news release that came out Wednesday this week quoting USDA NASS saying that they would not be, which was a bit surprising given what we'd been hearing. And then an interview from our colleagues in Illinois talking directly with Lance Honig, the USDA NASS, Kansas guy, saying that they definitely would take into account prevented planting numbers in a much earlier time frame in August than they normally do. Normally they start about September for the FSA to report that. So according to what he was quoted as saying, those prevented planting numbers will be in the room, in the lockup, when they put together their final numbers. So I guess I'm going on the idea that what he's quoted as saying will be true. And if that's the case, then this issue that we've been banting around for months now, is it 10 million acres, is it 12, 13 million acres, will be solved. The challenge is to see what the pre-report expectations are. Again, in July, the USDA said they projected for U.S. corn we had 91.7 million acres. The average of analysts' guesses on acreage is about 88. So that's only down 3 or 4. So something isn't coming together here, in terms of at least what we have understood to be prevented planting acreage figures, around 10 million acres, and this USDA estimate. So I guess if that number, if we come in with something closer to 10 million reduction, even an 8 million reduction in planted acres, then that's markedly different than what the market says they're expecting going into that Monday report. So you have a lot of potential for price volatility and numbers coming out of the USDA that are not expected by the market apparently right now. So the expectation right now for U.S. production is 13.19, basically 13.2 billion bushels at about 88 million planted acres. Well, if that number is 83, 84, 82, or something like that, times about 165 bushel an acre, which is what we are saying our yields are, well, we're closer to 12 than we are 13. So you bring all that together, there's just a lot of potential for volatility and for surprises in this August report. And really, given the weather issues that we've had the crop production uncertainty, the dryness that we've had now in the central and eastern Corn Belt. Parts of Kansas have been pretty dry, too, and folks in the Southwest will tell you that, at least until recent rains. And that, plus late pollination seasons under stress. So we have an awful lot of uncertainty with regard to the size of this corn crop, and those same weather stresses, they're affecting soybean production in those same eastern states. So we, I guess, haven't had a major bit of uncertainty that we've had to deal with in summer crop markets since about 2012. But I think we can safely say this qualifies as a very uncertain year. And there's a lot of potential in this August report, which will probably be more of an acreage focus, and the September, October, November reports, which might be more of a yield focus. A lot of potential for prices to move around and be responsive, surprised, et cetera, in regard to what hard numbers we finally do get out of the USDA reports, given what we'll have right now in August, but especially as we keep moving into September, October, November, into harvest and actually see what's out there. So I guess stay tuned. We'll have to see how all this plays out.
And just to briefly mention here, the trade is expecting actually slightly higher soybean acreage than what the USDA projected back in July. So apparently the trade is thinking that the prevented planting bug didn't hit beans nearly as hard as corn.
Or shifted about 1 million more corn acres that didn't get planted off into soybeans.
Right.
That could be it. We haven't even mentioned what could happen in grain sorghum and for planted acreage there. Again, a lot of these wet areas, when they went beyond the window for corn, did they go to grain sorghum? We'll be looking for this report to get some answer to that question.
And once more, that set of numbers will be out Monday morning at 11 o'clock from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Its updated report on grain stocks and the acreage numbers so eagerly awaited. Well, Dan, we appreciate the word. Next week, we'll hash through what those numbers had to say and much more as we take on the grain market trends once more. Many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, on this opening part of Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today continues now. Across the way now is wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato of K-State Research and Extension, noting that Romulo, coming up starting next week, will be back on the road participating actively in that series of pre-plant meetings for you wheat producers all around the state put on by K-State Research and Extension. As a lead into that, Romulo, we wanted to bring you by and talk about the wheat production research initiatives that you have ongoing here at K-State. You do have several angles you're working all at once, right?
Hi, Eric. Yes, actually, we have a very active applied research program where we're trying to look at management practices that producers can adopt in order to improve their yield, but essentially also their bottom line, their profitability, right? So we have we're looking at that in different angles. We have several small plot research trials that we do throughout the state. This year, we were close to 5,000 plots scattered around Kansas, and so those are placed in places like Belleville in north central Kansas, Hutchinson, south central, all the way to Leoti or Colby out west. So we're really trying to cover most of the wheat growing region with those small plot research trials. But we're also looking at trying to tap into existing databases, right? So like the variety performance trials that have been around for years and years. So we're trying to explore them a little bit more and also trying to learn from growers. So we're also doing some research projects where we are doing a survey of management practices and field-specific yield so we can actually try to understand at the farmer field what are some of the things that are actually affecting positively or even negatively wheat yields.
You'll be talking up a great lot of this at those pre-plant wheat schools coming up soon, but we do want to concentrate on a couple of things that you are working on. And you mentioned one, the on-farm survey of producers' wheat production practices. When did that start, and what sorts of things are you seeking out in that?
So that's a very exciting project, Eric, that the Kansas Wheat Commission is actually providing funds for us to do it for the third year consecutive now. And that's an effort by my student Brent Janish. He's actually going out and sitting down with producers and talking to them to understand their management practices. So this has been going on for 3 years now. So Brent started going out and talking to producers throughout the state, really central and western Kansas. We're focusing. This started back in 2016. We repeated 2017 and 2018 as well. So right now, we have 3 years of data that we collected from wheat producers around the state, and we're close to 700 fields that we have information from. So that's a very, very neat database that we can have a couple of different things. One of them, we can characterize what's the typical management that our growers are having in each part of the state. Right? What's their typical sowing date? What's their typical nitrogen rate? And things along these lines. But maybe more importantly, in each of these parts of the state, what is actually affecting yields on growers' fields, right? So this is very, very realistic, very boots on the ground. What are our growers doing? And what has been successful among these growers? Which management practices have been more often associated with yield?
Let's dig deeper into that, if we might. You mentioned some of the things you're inquiring about as you ask producers to be part of this survey. The seeding dates, do those vary quite a bit among producers?
Yeah, they actually range quite a bit. So just to give you an overview, we have now those close to 700 fields. The average yield of those fields that were interviewed was 57 bushels per acre in these 3 years. And they ranged from a minimum of 5 bushels per acre all the way to 106 bushels per acre. So a very, very wide variability in yield, right? And that variability also reflects in all the other practices. So, for example, planting date. If we look at South Central Kansas, the average was October 12, but it ranged from 23rd of September all the way to 21st of November. And for North Central Kansas, kind of a similar range there from 20th of September all the way to November 2nd. And then for Western Kansas was a little bit earlier, starting about 14th of September all the way to about 26th of October. So we're really being able to characterize the typical management practice, but maybe more importantly, how that's affecting yield. So as we are talking about sowing dates, one of the things that is very interesting that we're finding is that if we look at the potential yield as affected by sowing date, so the maximum yield among those growers for each sowing date that we're looking at, what we see is that more or less the optimum sowing date in South Central Kansas was close to October 12, but delaying sowing date didn't really affect much those potential yields. So delaying it close to the end of October there didn't really affect much. Growers were losing potential about a bushel per acre per day. But really delaying past November, now they're losing close to 3 bushels per acre per day if they're delaying past November. That yield loss with delaying sowing dates were much more steep in North Central Kansas. So there, the optimum date was about October 8th or so. But delaying planting there really did decrease the yields close to 2 bushels per day pretty consistently, right? Decreased yield potential. So again, remember that this is coming from growers' fields, right? And seems like in western Kansas, maybe because it gets colder sooner out there, delaying sowing date was actually affecting yield potential even more. So for each day that the planting was delayed past about September 25th, the potential yield was going down in about 3 up to 3.5 bushels per acre per day. So very, very important effect of planting date in wheat yield potential.
So quite interesting data on that variable. You have had an expressed interest since you arrived here at K-State in nitrogen rates and how those might be managed more acutely for wheat productivity. And that was one of the things you looked into in this survey as well, right?
Yeah, so here what we can look at is the total nitrogen applied by the grower and compare that to yield. So because here in Kansas, many years, we have a lot of residual nitrogen in the profile. Sometimes we don't find a lot of relationship there with the applied nitrogen and how that's affecting yield. And in our data, that was especially true for western Kansas. So if we look at western Kansas, the average nitrogen applied there was 56 pounds of nitrogen per acre and ranged from 0 all the way to 120. But really there was nothing. There was no relationship there of rate of nitrogen applied and yield, mostly because in many of those cases there was so much residual nitrogen in the soil when growers were planting that really, there was really no relationship there. We couldn't really find anything. Now, for north central Kansas and south central Kansas, we had a little bit more of an effect of the nitrogen rate there. So for those two regions, the average nitrogen rate was about between 92 and 98 pounds of nitrogen per acre and ranged from close to 20 all the way to close to 200 pounds per acre. So a pretty wide range of nitrogen rates applied. And typically, we were looking at the most efficient fields. So if we could see as efficient as we get, what are those fields that were the most efficient in using that nitrogen? And we could see that in north central Kansas, if we were applying more than about 100 units of nitrogen per acre, there was really no response. That was about the break point that we saw there. And below that rate, some of those fields were able to produce as much as 0.8 bushels per acre for every pound of nitrogen applied. So some of these fields using the nitrogen quite efficiently. These results were actually quite similar for south central Kansas as well, as far as nitrogen goes. Now, we're looking at several other things as well, right? We are asking each one of those producers for each one of those fields probably a good 30 questions of their typical management. So fungicides, application, seed treatment, crop rotation, and things along those lines. So if we could give a brief overview on generally what we're finding there. So if we look at seed treatment, right, and here we're looking at the combination of insecticide and fungicide seed treatment, we actually saw close to a 4 bushel per acre higher yields in fields getting that fungicide seed treatment in a good yielding conditions, in those years where the potential was good. In a very dry year, we saw essentially no benefit of that seed treatment. Very similarly, we can talk about the foliar fungicide as well. So this was the fungicide applied at flag leaf, for example. In the years of 2016 and 2017, among these fields that we were looking at, we had about a 10 bushel per acre increase in yield due to that foliar fungicide at flag leaf. Now, in a dry year, we still saw a trend of about 4 bushels per acre higher yield in fields that were getting fungicide. But overall, that was not significant. It was just like, it was numerically higher in about 4 to 5 bushels per acre, but this was not necessarily statistically significant there for growers. So foliar fungicide being very, very important and more important in a high-yielding year.
You've a boatload of information here, and once again, Romulo, you'll be sharing a great lot of this at those pre-plant wheat schools coming up soon, right?
Yes. So actually we have pre-plant meetings starting Monday of next week. About 12 pre-plant wheat schools lined out throughout the state. We're concentrating them in 2 weeks this year, between August 12th and August 23rd. We might have a few others that are not scheduled yet. Contact your county agents to try to see when your county is having one of these pre-plant meetings. If there's not one in your county, I'm sure there will be one in a neighboring county that you're more than welcome to attend as well.
Very well. And we're really not done here. Romulo, you have still more wheat production data that you've gathered that lends still more insight into what practices work best for producers here in the region. And we're going to have you back on Monday to cover that. Until then, many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
Wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato, K-State Research and Extension. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Now, in our 95th year of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture, this is the K-State Radio Network. And welcome back to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you as we turn to today's agricultural news headlines now, courtesy in part of DTN. The Environmental Protection Agency will no longer approve product labels that claim that glyphosate causes cancer. The agency announced that in a new guidance issued yesterday. California's Proposition 65 required products that contain glyphosate to include warning labels stating that the chemical is known to cause cancer. That law was challenged, and an injunction preventing its enforcement remains in place. The vast body of science done on the chemical, however, has found no direct link between glyphosate and human cancers. At last count, more than 18,000 lawsuits have been filed against Bayer, alleging glyphosate causes cancer. So far, Bayer has lost a handful of those product liability lawsuits. Juries have awarded plaintiffs hundreds of millions of dollars in those. The EPA back in May said it continues to find no human health risks associated with the use of glyphosate and that the herbicide is not a carcinogen. The agency reiterated that in its latest review. EPA is asking registrants with glyphosate products currently bearing the Proposition 65 warning language to submit their draft amended labeling that would remove the language within 90 days. In February of last year, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of California issued a preliminary injunction that stopped California from enforcing the state warning requirements. The preliminary injunction has not been appealed, and it does remain in place. Meantime, Bayer declined to comment today on a report that it was willing to pay up to $8 billion to settle those thousands of glyphosate lawsuits. A report published by the news agency Bloomberg sent Bayer's shares soaring as much as 11% as investors welcomed the prospect that those lawsuits could be put to rest. Quoting Bayer spokesperson Christian Hartel, "We do not comment on rumors." At a Farm Fest forum yesterday in Minnesota, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue and House Agriculture Committee Chairman Colin Peterson led a listening session with farmers. A farmer from Minnesota and the National Director for the American Soybean Association, Joel Schurz, told them that he did not think the continuing hardline approach with China was going to work, and in the meantime, soybean farmers, he said, are losing a long-term relationship with China. "I don't see that market coming back quickly," Schurz said. Quoting him, "It's not going to be a 6-month thing." Perdue disagreed, saying, quoting him, "I think we will get that market back." He went on to say it's got to be fair, free, and reciprocal. The secretary added that the U.S. is also exploring more markets in Southeast Asia and in India. With the trade tension ratcheting up again this week, Perdue and Peterson also spoke to reporters, with China largely dominating the questions. Perdue was asked what lies ahead within the next few months. And the secretary, quoting again, said, "My goal would be to have China play fair, to commit to what they committed to 20 years ago in the WTO, being the World Trade Organization." The secretary cited China's theft of intellectual property, such as shipping biotechnology seed corn to China to try to re-engineer the patented technology, as well as the forced transfer of that technology. He said that's not the way the number 2 economy in the world should trade, and he said that the president is pretty firm about that, and that China needs to change its ways and change its culture of trying to build its economy on the backs of cheating. The next step, said Perdue, the ball is in China's court. Now, as negotiations were progressing earlier this spring, the secretary said the hardliners in China got to President Xi Jinping, and then China began to backtrack on its commitments, including agricultural purchases. The secretary said that Chinese officials were having a meeting later this month. He also noted the market facilitation program sign-up just began for that second round of payments, and said there's no intention of going beyond the $16 billion program for now. Peterson said he disagreed with at least some of the president's trade moves and would have kept the U.S. in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Peterson said he's doing what he can to work with the administration to mitigate the challenges facing farmers. And he added that China is not in a position to buy more soybeans because of the decline of China's hog herd due to African swine fever. By some market estimations, China has lost or culled as much as half of its hog herd because of the disease. Perdue added that once China goes through its its frozen pork stocks. That country will ideally turn back to the U.S. for some pork. The secretary is saying, quoting, "We believe once they get their freezers emptied out, there will be a lot of demand for U.S. pork in China." Coming your way now, this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop, and waiting with that is Marcia Boswell.
Farmers looking to sharpen their skills and broaden their knowledge are invited to take part in the free Sorghum U, Wheat U event on August 14th at the Kansas Star Event Center in Mulvane. Wheat and sorghum producers can take home real-world practical solutions that can have a definite influence on their bottom line. With educational sessions targeted to wheat growers, sorghum growers, and sessions for both, producers can develop a strategy that will allow them to take control and plan for profit. Registration begins at 8:30 a.m. with the program starting at 9. During the welcome session, attendees will hear from a panel of farmers, as well as the Kansas Wheat and Kansas Grain Sorghum organizations. There is no charge to attend the Sorghum U, Wheat U event, and lunch will be provided. During breakout blocks 1 and 2, farmers will be able to choose from the following 4 sessions: Making Sense of Blockchain Technology, Make Cropping Systems Work for You, Lessons in Wheat Production, and Risk Management for Sorghum Producers. These blocks will repeat, so farmers will have the opportunity to attend 2 of the 4. Kansas State University Wheat and Forages Extension Specialist Romulo Lollato will present the session on wheat production. Over lunch, Arlen Cederman, the Chief Commodities Economist with INTL FC Stone, will present the keynote address on market intelligence for the future. Market intelligence helps producers plan ahead for influences on grain markets that are out of a producer's control. Suderman has years of experience working with farmers and helping them understand the markets. From late planting problems this spring to trade wars to African swine fever, Suderman will give producers an outlook that will help them make sound decisions. Topics for breakout blocks 3 and 4 include planning with your lender, making the grain chain work for you, risk management for wheat producers, and growing forage sorghum for profit. The event will wrap up at 3 p.m. following the IntelliFarms $20,000 giveaway. For more information on the speakers and topics, and to register for this free event, go to wheatu.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and this is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This Agriculture Today comes to a close. On Kansas agricultural weather, Mike's Side once more. Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, to look back at the week weather-wise in the state and look forward to the latest forecast and an update on our moisture conditions around Kansas, Mary. You could say definitively that eastern Kansas is sitting quite well, and then some in that regard, while spots in the west are starting to edge into persistent dryness.
Right. And for us, we talk about the week ending on Tuesday because that is what feeds into the U.S. Drought Monitor. And there was a really sharp divide between the eastern part of the state and the western part of the state. Eastern divisions all had more than double their normal rainfall for the week, and the southeast actually managed to be 3 times their rainfall for the week. They had an average of 2.77 inches. Northeast Kansas was a little drier. They only averaged 2.14, but again, enough that we had, again, flooding problems. Douglas County and Franklin County were the 2 areas that were very hard hit. There were reports in that area of 10 to 12 inches of rainfall. And again, on top of our already saturated ground, it was no surprise that we had that flooding issue. In contrast, you get into the western three divisions, and they did not even see a third of their normal rainfall. None of the divisions averaged as much as a quarter of an inch, so they're beginning to feel the stress of the low rainfall. The West Central Division was the driest. They averaged 0.06 of an inch, which is 8% of their normal.
Wow.
Yeah, which is not a whole lot, especially given the temperatures. And it's not surprising we had that split in temperature conditions as well. The west was warm and the east was on the cooler side. Statewide, we came in almost exactly normal for the week, which doesn't happen very often. But again, it was a big split between hot and dry in the west and cool and wet in the east.
Now, last week you noted that we had a portion of Kansas declared abnormally dry, and now that area has expanded some because of the recent conditions.
Right. The abnormally dry conditions expanded to the west and a little bit to the south in that area of southwest Kansas, west central, central, and south central. It kind of is on the corner of those four divisions. They didn't move into moderate drought yet because if we look at our April to August rainfall, all of these areas are still above normal for that. But the immediate shortfall of rain has moved it into that category. The question will be what comes up with this weekend's unsettled weather. Can we get enough moisture in that western two-thirds of the state to relieve that, or do we continue missing out on the storms in those critical areas?
Must note, though, because the record that you cite again ends on Tuesday, Wednesday there was rain, certainly in eastern Kansas, but parts of the west received moisture as well.
Right. Wednesday into Thursday, there was some fairly nice rains in northwest Kansas, north central Kansas, some in southwest and south central, kind of a circle effect of that unsettled weather. And we're talking about more than an inch of rain in some of these areas. Hill City, Goodland both reported almost 2 inches of rain. So again, some substantial rains in that area. Other areas did see moisture, probably not enough to eliminate that abnormally dry, but certainly to hold off any worsening conditions. And that's where the quantitative precip forecast for the next 7 days is very, very interesting. That looks at not just what are the probabilities of rainfall, but just how much do we expect to be squeezed out by these storms.
And what does that say?
Well, and that says that the heaviest moisture is going to be aligned in an arc from north central across all the western divisions and into the southern divisions. And it may be as much as 1 inch to 1.5 inches of rainfall in those areas. And that's for the week from today ending next Friday. Northeast Kansas may see a break in the amounts with about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of rain. Again, in this area, we'd certainly welcome a dry spell to allow some of that flooding to subside. But the western areas would be very happy if that forecast actually materialized.
And we will see what that portends because you say after that, the 8 to 14 day outlook indicates dry weather, and if western Kansas misses out in the coming week, it could be tough sledding ahead for those parts of the state.
Right. The 8 to 14, which carries us through about the 26th of August, is favoring drier than normal conditions across the state, coupled with warmer than normal temperatures. Not a good scenario for areas that are in moderate drought now, particularly troublesome for the soybean and sorghum crop. A lot of the corn has moved into the dent stage and would be close to finishing up. Not particularly favorable for them, but not nearly so troublesome as for the soybeans and sorghum. again, the question will be, how much moisture do we get this week and into next Friday to set us up before that dry spell that's forecasted for the end of the month. On the warm temperature side, that is an average of the highs and lows, so we may not necessarily see a repeat of that 100-plus readings that they've had out in western Kansas. It may be more a case of those nighttime lows staying elevated and keeping us on the warm side in that manner. Those elevated lows are likely to create more problem for livestock producers and confined cattle operations. Also can favor some of the diseases that like that higher humidity. Low nighttime temperatures, good indication that you've got a high humidity.
We will see what transpires this coming week. Mary, thank you for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. And likewise, our thanks to you for tuning in, and please rejoin us right here on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.